Well, I don't have anything bad to say about it. I do know that the Quebec government has recently taken moves to make it much more difficult for people to homeschool their children. And it's not like 5 years, 15 years ago, I would have presumed that the vast majority of people who were homeschooling their children were to be viewed with skepticism initially. I'm not so sure about that anymore. For example, I was sent a poster today. Someone sent me this link that they found in a local junior high school, and one of the media pieces that were recommended on this poster was a movie called Hedwig and the Angry Inch. Now, I thought that was a terrible movie, even though I'm perfectly capable of enjoying bizarre movies. But so it's a bizarre movie, that's for sure, but I also thought it was a terrible, bitter movie. Terrible and bitter. Those are separate. A movie can be bitter and be quite great, but it was a terrible movie and it was a bitter movie. But I can tell you one bloody thing about that movie. It's not required viewing for 12-year-old kids. That's for sure. So I think you have increasing reason to be skeptical of the public education system. I also looked at the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario's guidelines for education from kindergarten to grade 8, and what that is in essence, and I think I will do a video about it in the relatively near future, is a blueprint for transforming children into social justice warriors. It basically says that. It's like you don't have to be a conspiracy theory to read that. I mean, we have social justice tribunals in Ontario. And so the idea is, well, if you're going to get your children, if you're going to get people to, what would you say, favor equity properly, well, then you better start teaching them while they're young. It's like, maybe not. So now, you ask that question properly, because you say, well, the terrible education system, the wonderful mother homeschooling, right? That's the danger. It's like, no, because it might not be the wonderful mother homeschooling. It might be the pathological mother using the pathology of the education system as an excuse to get her talons into her children, right? Because that's certainly equally possible, or perhaps even more possible, because at least in the public education system, there's some necessity for consensus. So that's something that you have to be very aware of and work to prevent, right? And so I would say, if you're going to do that, probably best not to do it on your own. And it's like you need a board of advisors or something like that, and so maybe it can't just be you, and you have to figure out, well, what is the aim? And how are you going to manage that? And what makes you think you can do it? Even if it's being done badly publicly, what makes you think you could do it better? I mean, my general advice is, and people have asked me this, in fact, I had a conversation with the guy who was tiling my backyard this morning about something his son had said to him that he was taught at school recently, which really made the tiler, who had come from a rather authoritarian country, step back on its heels and think, I'm not so sure I should be sending my kid to public school anymore. Maybe I shouldn't be living in Toronto even. But my general advice is keep an eye on your kids and discuss with them what they're learning, and help equip them with the tools to not only to articulate their own viewpoint in response to what they're being taught. Now, the problem is you might not have the time nor the ability to do that. That's no simple thing. And increasingly, if you're unwilling to have your children participate in what is increasingly indoctrination and not education, thanks to, in no small part, to the Ontario Institute of the Studies on Education, which is an institution that I particularly despise, because I think that almost all it does now is produce indoctrinators of children. It's not an easy problem to solve. So more power to you wanting to put your children in a situation where they're not being indoctrinated. But the alternative is very, very complicated and difficult. So, yeah. The idea of cultural appropriation is absolute nonsense. So that's that. There's no difference between cultural appropriation and learning from one another. They're the same thing. Now, that doesn't mean that doesn't mean that there's no theft between people. There is. And it doesn't mean that just because you encounter someone else's ideas, you have an immediate right to those ideas as if they were your own. But the idea that manifesting in your own behavior some element of another culture, the idea that that's somehow immoral is insane. It's actually one of the bases of peace. One of the things that the various groups of human beings that exist have to offer each other is the tremendous value of their culture. It's been really interesting to me, for example, to watch the response of everyone, but for this argument, for young Caucasian males to hip-hop. There's an aggressiveness about hip-hop that's really attractive to young Caucasian males. And there's something absurd about the spectacle of the young Caucasian males taking on the persona of inner-city black gang members. But I'm sympathetic to it because there's an aggressiveness to that art form that's a necessary corrective to the insistence that the highest moral virtue for a modern man is harmlessness, which is absurd. Women don't even like harmless men. They hate them. They like to claw them apart. What women want are dangerous men who are civilized. And they want to help civilize them. Right? That's Beauty and the Beast. So, I'll tell you a funny story, and only engineers could have come up with this, because they're the only ones that have the unparalleled blindness to social convention that would allow them to discover it. So, the Google engineers, I like engineers, by the way, because they're very straightforward. The Google engineers wrote a book a while back called A Billion Wicked Thoughts, which was a study of internet searches, billions of them, literally. And they were looking a lot at pornography use. And, there's lots known about male pornography use, partly, and it's easy to understand. I mean, males are, pretty visually oriented, and what attracts them to pornography is fairly straightforward. You can tell that if you look at graffiti in a men's washroom, it's like 2 circles and a triangle, and the men are absolutely transfixed by it. So, for women, the story is more complex. They use pornography too, but it tends to be literary, because women tend to like words more than they like visual stimuli. And so the Google guys tried to track down the archetypal structure of, they didn't use those words, of female pornography use. And so some of you know, how many of you know what a Harlequin romance is? Okay, good. So those are archetypal stories, right? That's the taming of the wild man, essentially, by the desirable and virginal woman. And if you think women don't want that, then you better bloody well come up with an explanation for 50 Shades of Grey, right? Which is the most rapid-selling novel in human history, and emerged at exactly the same time that all of this noise about the absence of gender roles is being produced, en masse. It's like perfect female fantasy. It's exactly archetypally correct. It's Beauty and the Beast. So what the Google guys showed was the structure of Beauty and the Beast, although they didn't use that as a referent, that the female pornographic fantasy was wild guy, somewhat careless about the wants and desires of others, attractive to everyone, therefore high status, tamed by the magic of a single woman and brought into a relationship with her. Okay, but here's the comical part. This just made me laugh, man. It was like, what were the 5 categories of most desirable male entity used most broadly in female pornography? Oh, it's so embarrassing. Women, you have to cover your head while I say this. Vampire, werewolf, billionaire, surgeon, and pirate. This is something my wife has pointed out too. She said, well, men are going to have to stand up for themselves, but here's the problem. I know how to stand up to a man who's unfairly trespassing against me. And the reason I know that is because the parameters for my resistance are quite well defined, which is we talk, we argue, we push, and then it becomes physical.
right? Like if we move beyond the boundaries of civil discourse, we know what the next step is. Okay, that's forbidden in discourse with women. And so I don't think that men can control crazy women. I really don't believe it. I think that they have to throw their hands up in it's not even disbelief. It's that there's no step forward that you can take under those circumstances, because if the man is offensive enough and crazy enough, the reaction becomes physical right away, or at least the threat is there. And when men are talking to each other in any serious manner, that underlying threat of physicality is always there, especially if it's a real conversation, and it keeps the thing civilized to some degree. You know, if you're talking to a man who wouldn't fight with you under any circumstances whatsoever, then you're talking to someone to whom you have absolutely no respect. But I can't see any way. For example, there's a woman in Toronto who's been organizing this movement, let's say, against me and some other people who are going to do a free speech event, and she managed to organize quite effectively. And she's quite offensive, you might say. She compared us to Nazis, for example, which, you know, publicly, using the swastika, which wasn't really something I was all that fond of. But I'm defenseless against that kind of female insanity, because the techniques that I would use against a man who was employing those tactics are forbidden to me. So I don't know, like, it seems to me that it isn't men that have to stand up and say enough of this, even though that is what they should do. It seems to me that it's sane women who have to stand up against their crazy sisters and say, look, enough of that, enough man-hating, enough pathology, enough bringing disgrace on us as a gender. But the problem there, and then I'll stop my little tirade, is that most of the women I know who are sane are busy doing sane things, right? They're off, they have their career, they have their family, they're quite occupied, and they don't seem to have the time or maybe even the interest to go after their crazy harpy sisters. And so I don't see any regulating force for that terrible femininity. And it seems to me to be invading the culture and undermining the masculine power of the culture in a way that's, I think, fatal.